Yeah.
Today's daf is Chaf Pei 25 in Ketubot, Matzah Yevamot. And he told me he got to 4 lines from the bottom of Chaf Daled.
Yeah, I didn't go to him. I was with Jeff and we went further. We actually finished the first paragraph of Chaf Hey.
Got it. So I'm going to read it. I guess I can read it quickly because I think everyone here has done it a little bit, but it's a pretty short daf today, so there's no reason not to. So let me start there. Obviously, these are recordings, so there might be people who want to catch it on the recording. And so the discussion yesterday, and we'll continue today, is this very interesting discussion about how today is essentially once the first temple is no longer present, so that's the very broad today, how we determine how we trust and who we believe to be said to be a Kohen for many details, right? The Kohen does Nesiat Kapayim, they do Birkat Kohanim, which, presumably is a mitzvat aseh, right? Ko tivarchu. And so presumably if you do it and you're not supposed to do it, you're over you're violated essentially a lav haba mechla aseh, but it's a personal thing. It doesn't really have any consequence for anybody else, right? It's not our eating truma. So can you give truma? Can you eat truma? I think yesterday we talked about the matanot, which we'll talk about again today. Maybe we didn't talk about them yesterday.
Yeah, we didn't talk about them yesterday.
Okay, so I'm getting confused in the daf. But you give the matanot of an animal to the kohen, and of course, if you have a Beit HaMikdash, there's much more, of course, doing avodah and karbanot and all of that. But that's actually not relevant today. But for all those things, so we had this story, this very long pasuk from Ezra yesterday, that Ezra essentially looked and evaluated the Yuchasim, the genealogy maybe of all the people who came, and there was a family of Kohanim who were B'nai Barzilai, who was not a Kohen, right? Barzilai Giladi, who did not have, they couldn't find their papers basically, and so they said that you cannot eat me Kodesh HaKodashim until there's an Urim V'Tumim and we can clarify, right? Until there's some way that you can figure this out. But for now, you cannot be assumed to eat from Kodesh HaKodashim. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but we assumed in the beginning, that's where we're going to start today, that maybe, right, that we are allowing them to do Birkat Kohanim, to be essentially call themselves Kohanim. They just can't eat the Kodesh HaKodashim. They can't eat the Karbanot, right? And so we said yesterday that it's not a proof from there, right? Because even though we're going to allow them to act like Kohanim, the fact that there was this big public announcement, basically questioning their yichus, is well known. And so no one's going to assume that this family of Giladi, basically, Barzilai, is going to be real Kohanim or complete Kohanim. And so that's where we start today, 4 lines from the bottom. Because if you don't assume that they are basically a unique category because of how public this split was, then according to the one who says that if someone eats truma, that's good enough to assume that they are a kohen for marriage. So then how could you allow them to keep eating truma? Even the achli with truma, since you were allowing them, they ate truma before, right, in Bavel. They're coming to Israel now, you're allowing them to continue to eat truma, but ati la asukinu, they're going to bring them up to being married. Ella, it must be, lav mishum dereya cheskayo, it must be that their chazakah was already essentially weakened or ruined, and therefore no one's going to believe that. So you allow them to basically keep their status. They can do Birkat Kohanim, if they're men. They can eat Truma, right? But they're not going to be married as Kohanim. Says the well, if that's the case, so remember the whole story started yesterday by saying Gedolah Chazakah, where Rabbi Yossi said that Chazakah is really great because since these people are Kohanim before, even though we can't figure out exactly how they're Kohanim, we keep their status. So what's so great about that? Elamai Gedolah Chazakah, right? What was so great about this Chazakah? Because Me'ikara Achol B'Truma, before this story, they used to eat Truma, and so sorry, this is the answer. The answer is that because before, when they lived in Bavel, they ate Truma, but they only ate Truma Midrabanan, right? Because remember, outside of Eretz Yisrael, Truma is only Drabanan. Again, there's different opinions here, but from what grows outside of Eretz Yisrael, it's certainly only Drabanan. So Gedolah Meikar Achal B'Truma Drabanan. Too loud. They ate Truma Midrabanan, but Hashta Achal B'Truma Doraita. Now they're coming back to the land of Israel, and there's going to be Truma Doraita. So the fact that you allow them to remain Kohanim for eating Truma certainly elevates them in stature. So you see that the Chazakah is big enough to do that. or ibait ema, or some would say, there's a whole debate about, I think Tosfos takes out this ibait ema, doesn't make as much sense, but some would say, hashtanami b'truma d'Rabbanan achol, some, even now that they're going into Eretz Yisrael, they can only eat truma d'Rabbanan, like they did before. Excuse me. Truma d'Oraita lo achol. They still can eat truma d'Oraita. And again, we've discussed many, many times, truma d'Rabbanan could mean many things. It could be outside of Eretz Yisrael, inside of Eretz Yisrael, sorry. It could mean truma, as Rashi often says, on anything that's not dagan tirosh v'yitzar, right? Anything else that's other grains, other things that you grow that don't fit into that category of wine, grapes, and oil. There are others who talk about yirakot, of course, which are truma d'Rabbanan, so vegetables, which is a whole nother level. But this machloket about whether there's truma d'oraita on, apricots or other peirots, for example. But anyways, nowadays too, they can only eat truma d'Rabbanan, but truma d'oraita lo achol. And chimaskinan mi truma leyuchasin. When we said earlier that a person who eats truma can be assumed to be a kohen, and therefore you can allow them to marry someone as if they were a kohen. That's only true, but truma d'oraita. It's only if they eat truma d'oraita, but truma d'Rabbanan lo maskinan. So people like these kohanim who ate truma midrabanan and can only continue to eat truma d'Rabbanan cannot. No one's going to assume that they're allowed to marry as if they were kohanim. Says, well, again, if that's the case, what was so great about this chazakah? Right? You haven't elevated them in any way. They were eating this before. They're eating the same thing now. So lamai gedolah chazakah. What's so great about this chazakah that consistency or chazakah really matters? It's because afagav the ikam migzar mishum truma d'oraita lo gazrunan. Right here, because you come into Eretz Yisrael and all of a sudden you have truma d'oraita. Right, in Bavel, you didn't have truma d'oraita; it didn't exist. Here, they get shipments, I guess, of oranges from Yaffa, right? But here, that in Eretz Yisrael, you're going to have truma d'oraita. You might make a gzira and say, "Don't eat any truma," because people are going to come to think you're kohanim and get confused and not realize the chiddush is that you don't do that. You allow them to maintain their current status, and so they're allowed to continue eating truma d'Rabbanan.
That's a good question.
Yep.
The only thing about marrying like a kohen is that you have restrictions on, a man has restrictions on who he can marry. What does that mean to marry as if they're kohanim? Assuming that their children would be then kohanim and that they would not be like they can't marry.
Yeah, grusha v'chalutza.
Yeah, grusha v'chalutza. Is there other ramifications?
So no, that was the main ramifications, that whether someone can marry grusha v'chalutza. But I think the other aspect, of course, is that, as we discussed earlier in Yevamot a lot, is that there was a tremendous value being given to marrying to the families of Kohanim and consider that. Okay. So it goes for those things. Remember a lot of this, the background is, of course, that this is all based on the concept we talked about in Yevamot of ma'aleh asub yuchasim, right? That they made higher levels of stringency when it comes to marriage, I guess because it's permanent and has implications for the future generations. Rashi actually keeps throwing in, if you noticed, the question about when this person shows up, like in our Gemara before, and says, I'm a Kohen, right? And my friend's a Kohen. Or we're going to have today, I think, where the guy comes and says, this is my son, and he's a Kohen, right? So the question is he a Kohen and not a Yisrael, or is he a Kohen and not a Mamzer, right? Because there's two different questions. One is a Kohen as opposed to a sort of regular Yisrael. The second is it legitimate, right? And so those things mix together. But here, obviously, we're talking more about the level of kahuna and legitimacy. Says the Gemara now. James, I don't know if you hear us. I'm not sure if your connection is that good, but we're 8 lines from the top on Chav Hey Amud Aleph, 25a in Ketubot.
All good. I hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. Well,
and your charusa.
Great. We're all chavrutot here. It says the Gemara, "U'b'truma d'oraita lo achol." Is it true that these Kohanim, again, the backstory is these were a family of Kohanim who came up from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. They were investigated by Ezra, and they did not have good papers, right? They could not prove the generations of Kohanim going back to whoever you have to do, whatever verified person you have to go back to. So it says in the pasuk that we don't know what to do. So I'll read the pasuk again. It's on Amud Bet. Lo yochlu mikodesh hakodashim. They should not eat the kodesh hakodashim ad amod kohen l'urim v'tumim, until there's a kohen who can come and prophesy, basically. But so how could you say they can't eat truma d'oraita? Truma d'oraita lo achol. They cannot eat truma d'oraita. Haktiv. It says again. I just read the pasuk. Lo yochlu mikodesh hakodashim. they can't eat the Kodesh HaKodashim. The Kodesh HaKodashim means the Holy of Holies, which we assume means karbanot, right? There's going to be a Beit HaMikdash. You can't go and bring a Kohen and eat carbon chatat or eat, the portion that a Kohen's allowed to eat. But it implies that the Kodesh HaKodashim hu delo achol. They can't eat kodshim, but truma doraita achol. They can eat everything else, including truma. Says Gemara, you're wrong, because Kodesh HaKodashim does not mean karbanot. Hachi kamar. Kodesh HaKodashim means lo b'midi de'ikri kodesh, not the thing that's called kodesh, which is truma. Dichtiv v'chol zar lo yochal kodesh. It says a zar. It's referring here to a zar non-kohen, not a zar. A zar non-kohen can eat kodesh, which means in this case, in the context, it means truma. And the word kodashim is lo b'midi de'ikri kodashim. They can't eat the things that are called kodashim. One of the things that are called kodashim, that's referring to the matanot kahuna, the parts of the animal that you give as a gift to the kohen, that like the chazeh and the shok, right? Those parts of the animal that you have to give to a kohen. Dichtiv, and how do we know that? It's based on the pasuk which says, and we had this in Yevamot recently, ubat kohen ki tiyeh li'ishzar, right? A daughter of a kohen who's allowed to eat truma when she's in her father's house. If she marries a non-kohen, he b'trumat hakadoshim lo tochal. She should not ever eat trumat hakadoshim. What does trumat hakadoshim mean, right? It means, we learned in Yevamot, Amar Mar, b'muram min hakadoshim lo tochal. She can't eat the thing that is separated as part of the kodesh, and that was referring to the matnot kuhuna, the chazeh v'shok. And so, that was a very interesting halacha we had in Yevamot, that if a woman is a bat kohen, she's a kohenet, she marries a Yisrael, she can't eat truma. If she gets divorced, her husband dies, she goes back to her father's house when there's no kids, remember, and she can eat truma, but she's not allowed to eat matnot kuhuna, right? Even though she can eat truma, she can't eat the matanot of the kohen. And here too, that's what it refers to. It says they cannot eat kodesh kodeshim, means that they can't eat truma, which is kodesh, and they can't eat matnos kuna, which is kodeshim. And so in fact, the Torah is saying that these kohanim were not verified, and they cannot eat truma doraita. They can eat truma dorabanan because we continue them in their current state. Okay, so that's the end of that story. Now Tashma, let's bring a proof, or try to bring a proof about all these relationships. Can you be ma'aleh? Can you raise a kohen from one status to another? If there's a lot of background. Here, maybe we can mute you. It might be my connection. Let's see. Sounds a little better. Tashma, chazaka lekuhuna, a chazaka that a person is a kohen is if they do nisiyat kapayim beBavel, if they do birkat kohanim in Bavel. Now we've again discussed this yesterday, but basically that concept is that people would either be checked, right? If someone stood up in the front of shul and started doing birkat kohanim, people would start asking questions. And if they weren't a kohen, everyone loves to go on Twitter, right, and expose them as being not a kohen. So as long as it's in a public place, which is what Bavel was, if someone gets up to do something, you assume that they're going to be checked out, that everyone's going to look into it. Like a new kohen in town, they'll ask a lot of questions. So that's one proof. Or achilat chala b'Surya, or if someone eats chala in Surya, actually goes through a long explanation here, or short explanation, but it's explanation that Surya is an area of, well, Surya is Syria, of course, right, where David conquered the land. It's not included in the original land of Eretz Canaan, but David conquered it, and there's a debate about what the status is, but essentially we're considering it to be part of Israel. We're assuming eating chala is like eating truma, right, which is given to a kohen, this midoraita in Surya. And so since this person ate chala, we assume they're a kohen. And chiluk matanot bikrachim. And if they were given the matanot, meaning remember the person would, shecht an animal, they'd give the matanot to a kohen. This person in a big city goes to the butcher house and says, I'm a kohen, I want the parts. So the reason a big city matters is that there's a lot of people who know them, that see them, and can evaluate. If you did it in some out of town village, then there's no proof. Maybe a fraudster came and would get up and say, I'm a kohen. But if you do it in a big city, we assume that you're exposing yourself to judgment and to a verification. So in all these cases, you can give them a chazaka lekuhuna. Now, what does it mean lekuhuna? We assume it means my level yuchasin, that for marriage purposes, for genealogy, we call you a kohen. And what you see from here is that as long as a person does birkat kohanim and no one sort of questions them, that they can be assumed to be a kohen, then we're low. That's not a proof. It could be the truma. That we're saying that you can give them truma in these cases, but there's a higher level of verification that you need for marriage. That's ridiculous. Secondly, it's for truma. It says dumya dachilat chala katani. It says a person eats challah in Surya. Right now, obviously, a person eats challah in Surya. You're not saying, oh, they're allowed to eat truma. Eating challah and eating truma is the same thing. It must mean you allow them marry as if they're a kohen. And it gave a list of 3 things. So ma achilat challah must be liyuchasin. Nesiat kapayim liyuchasin. No, it's not correct. You made a wrong assumption. It could be achilat challah gufa l'truma. Because achilat challah, we're saying, if you watch a person eat challah and nobody stops them or nobody questions them, they can then eat truma. And why is that a chiddush if it's the same thing? Because kasavar, this Tana holds challah b'zman hazeh d'Rabbanan. In fact, the whole mitzvah of giving challah to a kohen nowadays is always a reference to after the destruction, at least of the first Beit HaMikdash, maybe also the second, but probably more the first Beit HaMikdash, that nowadays, once that original kedusha was, well, we'll discuss it, but was paused, it's only d'Rabbanan. And truma is d'oraita. Truma remains in Eretz Yisrael to be d'oraita. And the chiddush is that if someone's eating challah, we assume they're a kohen, and we even allow you to give them truma d'oraita. Umaskinan michala d'Rabbanan. You can go up, and then you can include the person's a kohen from the fact that they eat challah, which is only d'Rabbanan, but truma d'oraita. So that's a chiddush. It's certainly a big chiddush. And it might be the same thing about Nesiat Kapayim. If you see a kohen doing Birkat Kohanim, you allow them to eat truma, right? But you don't necessarily allow them to marry as if they're a kohen without further proof. And this, in fact, relies on the opinion as Rav Huna bar Yeshua, which we're about to quote, switched the opinion of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan's opinion was the exact opposite. The truma today is Rabbanan and challah is d'oraita. And Rav Huna said, I disagree, and I think the opposite, and that's what this Braita seems to be going according to. Now, where do we see that? Tashma, we're going to see it in the next Braita. This is a Tosefta. The Tosefta says, chazaka lekuhuna. What's a chazaka for calling someone a kohen? That's either Nesiat Kapayim, right, just like we quoted before, doing Birkat Kohanim, or Chiluk Granot Beretz Yisrael, someone in Israel who goes to the Goren, right, the grain part, right, not the Goren means grain, but the Goren where they made the piles of grain and gets Truma. Chiluk Granot means they get Truma, basically. And Bisuria, and also, Eretz Yisrael Ubisuria, Ubechol Makom Sheshluchei Rosh Chodesh Megi'im. And any place where the Shluchei Rosh Chodesh can reach, which means within around 2 weeks distance without Shabbos of Eretz Yisrael, of the Beit Din. So they would send out messengers to tell when Pesach is and when Shavuot is. The messengers didn't get there within 2 weeks. There's no point in going, right? Because you already missed Pesach and Shavuot. And eventually you get a letter, before the next month maybe, but there's no point in rushing out. But in those places, Rashi explains, those places are just places that had a Beit Din. Because if in order for them to basically change the Moadim, they would have to have messengers come, testify to a Beit Din. The Beit Din would put up signs, right? Pesach is going to be next Thursday, let's say. So those were places that had a Beit Din. And basically it's just a marker. But any place that has a Beit Din, basically, in those places, if a person acts in a way that they're a Kohen, it can be verified, right? There's an authority that can establish it. If you live in a place in the Wild West, right, there's no Beit Din, then saying you're a Kohen doesn't prove anything, right? There's no one who's going to challenge you. So says the Braita, in all of these places, if a person, is getting Truma or doing Nesiat Kapayim, then it's a proof that they're a Kohen, right? Where am I? Nesiat So now, says the Gemara, let's analyze it, or this is Braita actually. Nesiat Kapayim Raya, right? Avalo chiluk granot chiluk granot, right? So it's a proof, that if you do nesiat kapayim, but in these places where Beit Din comes, chiluk granot is not enough. Ubavel kesurya. Right, to finish by saying that Bavel, which of course is not part of Eretz Yisrael, but it is a very learned place where there's many Beit Dins, but Beit Dinim is like Surya. And Reb Shimon Gamliel adds Af Alexandria Shel Mitzrayim, right, Rishona. Initially, historical Alexandria, before it was destroyed, also fit that category. Nipnei Shebeit Din Kavuin Sham, because when Alexandria had thousands of Jews, there was a big Beit Din there. So even though, of course, it's very far away, Alexandria, you're not going to get there in 14 days from Yerushalayim, right, or from anywhere Beit Din is. But if there's a big Beit Din there, then if a person is acting like a Kohen there, he's doing Siyat Kapayim, then they can be treated as a Kohen. Okay, now, Katani Miyat. Now, the Braita, of course, said nisiut kapayim, that if you see a kohen doing birkat kohanim, you treat them like a kohen for all matters. What does that mean for all matters? My love, the yuchasim. Presumably, it's referring to yuchasim, right? Now, it can't be referring to truma. This is like we said earlier, because the next case in the Braita was if they're collecting truma at the Beit HaGoren, right? So you can't be, obviously, you're not saying if you're collecting truma, you treat him like a coin for truma. He's already getting truma, right? So it must be for yuchasim. Or no, it's for the other case. It's for challah, lo lechallah, right? It's that you're allowed to treat them like a kohen and give them challah. There's more that can't be. Hadumya dechiluk ranot katan. It says right next to it if the person is accepting handouts at the granot. And as we're assuming that challah and truma are the same thing, like we did before, ma chiluk granot liyuchasim. It must be that if you are calling him a kohen, if he's accepting truma, it's for yuchasim. So afnesiat kapayim liyuchasim, and the answer, just like we did before, that it's not necessarily the case by truma either, because chiluk granot gufa lechala, right? When you say that if you treat someone who's getting grain at the collection place for truma as a kohen, that's for the purposes of challah. And the Kasavar, this Tana holds, Truma Bizman Azed Drabanan, that Truma is today Drabanan, after Eretz Yisrael was Kedusha Rishona, which Kedusha L'Shatav, Lo L'Atid Lavo. And so the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, Doraita goes away. There's still Kedusha Drabanan, but that's only Drabanan. And Chala is not conditional on the same thing, it's Doraita. And therefore the Chiddush is that Maskinan, you can make a conclusion that he's a Kohen, Mitruma Drabanan, the Chala Doraita, right? And so that is the opinion of the Chachamim. As we said, and we're about to say again, that Rav Huna, Breder of Yeshua, questioned that and said the opposite. And that's the machloket about whether Chala is a proof for Truma and Truma is a proof for Chala, but none of it is a proof for Yuchasim. You still need a higher level of proof for a Kohen to be called a Kohen for Yichus. And Kidashkechinu, Rav Huna, Breder of Yeshua, Rabbanan. Right, once Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua bumped into it, he found the Rabbanan. The Amar Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua said the story over that Ashkechtinu the Rabbanan beBei Rav. I once, walked into the Beit Midrash and the Rabbanan beBei Rav were Yatfi. They were sitting around and they were Ka'amri Afilu Laman da Amar Truma Zman Azed Rabbanan. Even according to the opinion that nowadays after the destruction of the first temple, Truma is Drabanan, Chala is D'oraita. Chala remains Doraita. Now, why is that? And so again, it's a very fascinating and very halachically important question about Truma and Chala, Drabanan and Doraita, right? But remember that the question of Truma and really most other rules, not all, but most other rules that have to do with the land of Israel have to do with this question of Kedusha Rishona, Kedusha L'Sha'ata, and was it Kedusha L'Atid Lavo or not, right? It was original Kedusha. The Jews came in. They then obviously left the land. They were exiled, unfortunately, right, this week in the beginning of Av, right? That was the first destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. The question is, did that ever come back? Did the Kedusha ever return? However, Chala has its own category. And the reason Chala has its own category, which we're about to quote in the Gemara, is that by every single, there's a long Braita, which I don't think we quote the whole thing here in the Sifri, that goes through this, which is that by most mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, it says ki tavo, right? When you come to the land. By Chala, it doesn't say that. By Chala, it says bivo achem el haaretz, as you are coming to. That's the only exception, right? And so the question is, what does bivo achem teach you that's different than ki tavo? So the simple explanation, which we'll see is not entirely correct, is that ki tavo means when you arrive. What does arriving mean? That's a question, right? What does arriving mean? So we're going to say later in a minute, arriving probably means when you finish conquering the land, you divide it, right? Of course, once you leave, the question is, did you lose your arrival status? But by Chala, it says bivo achem, which implies a more loose explanation that when you, in this understanding, when you are coming, right? So when you're coming into the land, which means that it has a more I would say liberal, maybe liberal is the wrong word, a more loose explanation of when, a more generous maybe terminology of when you're chayiv and chal. And we're going to quote some of this Braita. We actually don't quote the whole thing, unfortunately. But this is the case that happened. So Rav Huna, Breder of Yeshua, bumped into the Rabbanan. And they said, Afilu Laman Damar Trumas Manazed Rabbanan, Chala Doraita. So even today, according to the ones who say that nowadays, and of course they were in the times of the Amoraim, right, after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, which is similar to today, right? There was that Truma is D'Rabbanan. Everyone would agree that Chala is Doraita. Because in the 7 years and the 14 years, right? The 7 years that they were conquering the land and 7 years that they were dividing up the land, from the time they entered the land with Yoshua till they had finally sort of split it up and everyone went back home, was 14 years. During that time, nitchayvu b'chala, they had to take chala midoraita, v'lo nitchayvu b'truma. You didn't have to take truma, right? Because if you say ki tavo, they didn't arrive yet. They hadn't set it up. But bivoachem means they were coming. They were in the process of coming, right? So that's what the Chachamim said. Amina lehu anna, Rafuna Breit of Yeshua said to them, you're totally wrong. Adarabba, it's the exact opposite. Afilu leman da'amar truma b'zman hazeh do'oraita, even if you held the truma today is do'oraita, because the kedusha lasts, chala is drabanan. The chala is only drabanan, and it's the exact opposite understanding, right? Because if you say ki tavo, it implies, according to Rafuna Breit of Yeshua, that it's a one-time thing. Once you come, the fact that you leave doesn't change the fact that you came. Right, so once Bnei Yisrael went to Eretz Yisrael, there's truma. The fact that we're exiled does not take away that status. But chala requires us to be in the process of being there. And once you're not there, how you would view it today is I'm not sure. But once you're not there, you lose the category of chala. So it's not once you arrive. It's while you're there, basically. And so once you're no longer there, again, what does no longer? Does it mean the majority is no longer there? You have no control. Would chala today be doraita? These are all questions, of course, that have come up in the last 100 years, right? And are not going to be resolved in the Gemara today, I can assure you. So, but that's what Rav Huna said to them. And in fact, it's based on this following Breita. And again, we quote a very small part of the Breita. The Tanya, the Breita says, "B'vo'achem el haaretz." It says by chala that you take it when you're coming to the land. And the Breita says, well, b'vo'achem, you might think that means even if 5 people show up, right? What if no one came to Eretz Yisrael yet, but you sent ahead 2 or 3 spies, like Yoshua did, right, to come? Is that already the process of coming, right? Yachol, you might think that already you're on your way. So basically, you have to take chala, even though 99.9% of the people are on Evar Yarden. Talmud, therefore, it says bivoachem, which means biviat kulchem amarti. All of the people, again, this would have relevance for today, of course, right? All of the people have to be there, below beviat mitzatchem, not when some of you are there. Excuse me. And therefore, says Rav Huna Breit of Yeshua, since when Ezra came back up, Chiaskinu Ezra, lav kulu salik. Right? When Ezra came back up for the second Beit HaMikdash, or after the second Beit HaMikdash, not all of the people came up. And since not all of the people came up, you don't fulfill the category of bivoachem, which means when all of you come, right? Now, again, the question halachically would be, what percentage do you need? Do you need a majority, right? When Ezra came, it seems, so Rashi says rubam here. That's what Rashi makes it sound like it's a majority, right? That when Ezra came, most people stayed in Bavel. But what if 75% of people came back? Then so these are all questions that, of course, will come up for today to understand whether chala is doraita or not. So that is the machloket between the Rabbi Huna Breit of Yeshua, I think. Yeah, Huna Breit of Yeshua and the Chachamim.
If it's based on majority, those living outside of the Israel would be need to do chala as well.
So there's 2 separate things, right? So one is the question of which grain you're talking about. So it might be only grain that's grown in Israel. That's one question. And the second is whether, in fact, even in Israel, there's a chiyuv. And Rav Huna Breit Yeshua is referring to the second one, not the first, not which grain is chayiv, but even grain from Israel, if most, and again, I'm saying most, it's not so clear, it could be all. But if the majority, let's say, it says all of them, if all of Bnei Yisrael does not live in Eretz Yisrael, there's no chiyuv of chala midoraita. There might still be derabanan, but that's how
You're right. If it's just a simple majority, would that make it a commandment for all Bnei Israel, no matter where they're living?
Potentially, yeah. But again, it might be that only if it's grain of, it probably is only if it's grain of Israel or Syria.
Right. Okay.
But yes, but if let's say you made aliyah, or if you, like nowadays, it's obviously different relevance because they ship grain, right? Or they cook grain. So in theory, if you shipped grain from Eretz Yisrael, you'd be chayav. It's not where the grain is; it's where it grew.
Right.
And I think, again, I don't like to say too much halacha because I don't really know it, but I think we paskin is drabanan, But I think this question has come up a lot about whether we should change this halakha in light of current statistics, right? So
Right.
you can imagine it's a complicated question. Miriam, do you know more about challah than I just said about how we paskin today?
No, not on that end.
I think we do paskin that way. But anyways, but it certainly is a chiyuv d'Rabbanan, even if there's not d'oraita. Tashma,
If people take it, if you make more than 5 pounds
Right.
of grain,
and they make a bracha.
make a bracha. 5 pounds a week.
Tashma. So continues the Gemara on top, back to our topic of kuhuna. Chazakah the kuhuna nesiyat kapayim. Right. The Braita says chazakah for calling a person a kohen. Again, we're going to ask for what purpose we call him a kohen. Is doing nesiyat kapayim, doing birkat kohanim, and chiluk granot, and if they do, they get a portion of the grain as truma in the goren, and edut, and if you have testimony that they're a kohen. So what does edut have to do? It's not a chazakah, right? It's not a something you can rely on. It's a testimony. Edut chazakahi, right? So I ask what edut chazakahi is. You calling edut a chazakah? Alav hachikama. What the Braita must be saying is that nisiyat kapayim, knowing that a kohen does birkat kohanim and nobody has questioned it, is ki edut. Just 2 witnesses come and say, we knew his father, we know he was a son. Again, how exactly you know as a son is not so clear, but he lived his whole life as a son. He grew up in the family. So just like edut is liyuchasin, we'll believe that for marriage. So maybe after siyat kapayim liyuchasin. So why don't we prove from here that if you see a kohen being birkat kohanim and no one questioned it, he would be allowed to be married as a kohen? No, it's not the case. The case is edut haba mikoach chazakah. We're talking about with testimony that came from a chazakah, meaning they didn't testify that we saw that he's a kohen, right? Not we saw. We know his father. We know his family. We know that he's a kohen. They testified is that we saw him doing things that only a kohen would do. In which case, it's basically the same chazakah, right? It's relying on sort of indirect testimony that he behaves like a kohen. Nobody stopped him from behaving like a kohen, and therefore we assume he was checked out by somebody. But nobody came and said, I checked him out, or I have a yuchas star, a book that says this person is a kohen. And so essentially that's the equivalent. It's basically either we saw him being birkat kohanim, or someone came and said, oh, when we used to live in Netanya, we saw him doing birkat kohanim. So that's the same sort of status. And it's like the following story. There was once a person who came in front of Reb Ami, Amalei, and he said, I come from Pittsburgh, but I have a chazakah that this man standing here, who I guess they were trying to figure out what he was, is a kohen. So they said to him, how do you know he's a kohen? Like, what's your proof? Well, why do you assume that? Amalei Mara Ita, what's your reason to think he's a kohen? Amalei, because I saw Shekara Rishon Beit HaKnesset. I saw that he was called up for the first aliyah in Shul, the chazakah Shehu Kohen. And again, and doesn't just mean it happened once. It means you're either in a shul where people, it's a big enough shul that they check, and other people would question and be like, I'm a kohen, why are you taking my spot? So the fact that there wasn't a big tumult about it implies he's a kohen. Says the Gemara, well, how do you know he was a chazakah Shehu Kohen? Remember, we learned in Megillah that you can call up a person who's a gadol, right? We talked about all the rabbis who were being called up for the first aliyah in front of a kohen. So maybe it's chazakah Shehu gadol. Right? Maybe the chazakah, the reason he was called up first is because he was a great person. So, well, and there actually is a whole discussion here. Today we call up people by their name and they say HaKohen, right? So many Rishonim point out from here that they must have not done that back then. Otherwise, you would know. They called him up Avraham ben Yitzchak HaKohen. It's not because he's the greatest, it's because he's a Kohen, right? Or maybe a lot of people had the last name Cohen, so you didn't know. But
there's a minion, I know, the Sephardi minion. They decided that if you call somebody up like Kohen or Rishon, because if that person then can't come up, it's sort of somehow a tool of the calling up.
So wait, so what do they call them?
They basically say, you, right. Rishon, or you, Kohen, come here. And then they announce it when they get up to the.
Got it. In case they don't come, right. There's Gemara talks about that as well in Megillah. So that's, anyways, obviously there were different customs to how you call people up, which there probably still are, as there are clearly today. But so he asked him, how do you know he's a Kohen? Maybe they called him up first because he's the greatest. He answered, well, because Shekara Achrav Levi, because then the next aliyah went to a Levi, person I knew was a Levi. And if you remember, we learned in Megillah that if there's no Kohen, we said the words were nitpardua chavila, right? The chain is broken. Meaning you don't go Levi after a person who's not a Kohen, right? You might call Levi first, but you don't go Levi second, right? So if you call a Gadol as the first, you don't call a Levi as the second. You just call a Yisrael, right? You call whoever you want, or not whoever you want. You call Yisrael. So the fact that they called after him a person who I knew was a Levi means that they knew he was a Kohen. And this was the testimony he gave to Reb Ami, and says the Gemara, "Hella Reb Ami the Kuna al Piv." Reb Ami relied on this to call him a Kohen and to give him truma and to treat him like a Kohen. A similar story. There was a person who came in front of Bishul ben Levi. Amarlein, they said to him, "Muchsakani b'zeshu Levi." I know that this guy is a Levi. Now, why does it matter if you're a Levi? Of course, if you're giving maaser, right? You can give a lot of money to a Levi. So I know that he's a Levi. And he said, "How do you know?" Amarlein Maraita. Amarlein Shekara Sheni beBeit HaKnesset v'Chaskashu Levi. You got the second aliyah, right? So he says, "Well, how do you know? Maybe Chaskashu Gadol. Maybe you got the second aliyah because he's a great person, and they used to do that sometimes as well, right? You'd give an aliyah because someone who's great." He said, "Well, Shekara lefanav Kohen." The same thing, which is that the first aliyah went to someone I knew was a Kohen. When someone who you know is a Kohen, you don't give the second one to anyone else unless they're a Levi. And if there's no Levi, remember, you give it to the same Kohen again. That's what we do. Or you call that person again. And it's for this reason. It's because you don't want people to conclude, oh, you read second in the shul, you must be a Levi, right? So if there's a Kohen called first, you only call a Levi second. And that's what happened. And he believed that the Hela, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the Levi'ah, Alpiv, he called him Levi based on that. Another case, Huda Ata Kamed Reish Lakish. There was a person who came in front of Reish Lakish, and Amrlei said, "Machsakani b'zeshu Kohen." I know that this guy is a Kohen. And so Reish Lakish said, "How do you know?" Amrlei Mara Ita. Amrlei, this Amrlei is not so clear. So the simplest understanding is that this is actually Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi speaking still. He said to him, "Is it because Shekara Rishon beBeit HaKnesset?" And he was about to question that. So he said back to him, Amalei, "No, it's because Re'itev Shechilek al Hagranot." I saw that he was standing on the Goren, right? He was standing at the end of the harvest season. He went to the granary, I guess is probably what you call it, and he collected the truma. The fact that I saw him collecting the truma means that he's a Kohen, and we can prove that he's a Kohen. Now, this is what he said to Reish Lakish, right? Amar lo Reb Elazar, says Reb Elazar, I don't get it. That's all you can prove? Meaning you're basically telling Reish Lakish that a person calling to the Torah is not enough, right? But getting the truma is how you can establish someone's a Kohen. What if Ein Sham Goren? Let's say you're in a place where there's no grain. Let's say you live in, Riverdale. So then Batla Kuna, right? Then you're not going to call someone a Kohen. So how could you only rely on that siman? You need to have more simanim. And he was implying you need to rely on someone getting an aliyah to be considered a Kohen. That was the debate or the conversation between Reish Lakish and Reb Elazar. Now, it happened to happen, right? Zimnin, one time, Haviyatvi Kamed Reb Yochanan. Both Reish Lakish, who was a student and rival, I guess, of Reb Yochanan, and Reb Elazar, who was a student of Reb Yochanan, were sitting in front of him. And Ata Kiham Masa the Kameh, and the exact same story happened in front of them. A guy came and said, "I know this other person's a Kohen." He asked him how. He said, "Because I saw him." Amalei Reish Lakish. Did you re'itav shechilek al hagor? He asked him, "Did you ever see him getting truma?" Right? I want to prove he's a Kohen. And said Reb Yochanan to him, "What do you mean? Did you ever see him getting truma? That's the only proof you're a Kohen? Im ein sham goren batla kuna. If there's no goren, are you going to then cancel anyone from being called a Kohen?" So Reb Yochanan criticized him basically and said, "Well, even if you see him getting an aliyah." But of course, Reish Lakish said to himself, "I think I heard those words before." Right? Rebbe Elazar said the exact same words to me last month. Clearly, Rebbe Elazar heard them from his teacher, Rebbe Yochanan. Right? So it says he turned around or he looked. Hadar Chazya, the Rebbe Elazar, bishut. He looked at Rebbe Elazar with, it's hard to translate bishut. It means with embarrassment, humiliation, like he was, he glared at him. And he basically said, Amar, Shamat Mili, the Bar Nafcha, Vo Amrit Lam Nishmei. You heard this from Bar Nafcha, which was the name for Rabbi Yochanan, maybe because his father was a blacksmith, right? A nafcha. There's other explanations, but that's one. And you didn't tell me in his name. So he got angry at Rabbi Elazar for basically quoting it as if it was his own thing. Not so much because he's taking credit, but because Reish Lakish probably thought less highly of Rabbi Elazar's opinion and more highly of Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, right? So you didn't tell me you were saying it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan.
And we had the story about Rav Yochanan getting really angry when people didn't quote his name. And
Correct. Yeah, this comes up. It's an interesting discussion. I don't know if you guys heard that. Rabbi Yochanan gets very angry when people don't quote him in his name. And remember that Rabbi Lazar is the one who always says that you have to quote someone in their name and their siftotav dovavot bekever. But Rabbi Lazar says that. So there's actually a whole discussion here about why Rabbi Lazar didn't say it in his name. And some say it's because Rabbi Lazar always was such a close talmid of Rabbi Yochanan that everything he said was assumed to be in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So that he took it for granted. And then there's this whole discussion about, if you're a Talmud Mufak, you have to say it in their name. It's actually a fascinating and detailed discussion that some of it's quoted here in the Rishonim. I think it's a Ritzvah, but anyways, the Rishonim discussed it. Anyways, that was the story. No, it's a good story. Rebbe Chia. Now, last two cases for today one happened to Rebbe and one happened to Rebbe Chia, who were, students and peers of each other. Rebbe was the last Tana, and Rebbe Chia was either the first generation Amoraim or a Tana Upalig. But Rebbe and Rebbe Chia, one of them, Chad Hela Ben Api Aviv Lekuna. One, there was a son who wasn't clearly related to his father, meaning it wasn't well known that he was a son of the father. He showed up at some point. And one of them believed the father to say, this is my son, and therefore he's a Kohen because I'm a Kohen. And Chad Hela Ach Api Achiv Levia. One had a similar thing where I had a brother, that some guy showed up, and the man said, oh yeah, this is my brother, I'm a Levi, he's a Levi. What were we tistayim? Let us prove, let us conclude, the Rebbe Hela Ben Api Aviv Lekuna, that it was Rebbe who believed the father, to elevate the son to be a Kohen. Why do we say that? Because there's actually a Braita where Rebbe seems to imply that. The Tanya says the Braita, second to last narrow line in my Gemara. Amar B'nizeh v'kohendu. Let's say a person shows up and he says, oh, this kid who showed up, on the boat yesterday is my long lost son. And he happens to be a Kohen, right? Now, what does that mean? Meaning he's my son, I'm a Kohen, but he's not a mamzer. He's not in a team. His mother was legitimate, whatever the circumstances were. I testify, of course, I'm testifying about my own relation, that he is both my son, says the father, and he is a legitimate Kohen. So says the Braita, Ne'eman lahachilo b'truma. In fact, you can rely on that testimony of the father to allow him to eat truma. But eino ne'eman lahasio isha. But that's not good enough to get him to marry a woman. Now, again, this is where Rashi makes the point I mentioned earlier, that Rashi says it means you can't marry anybody because he might be a mamzer and a tin. You don't believe the father for that purpose. Right? The other explanation might be that you can't marry a person who a Kohen would only be allowed to marry, right? But Rashi makes it sound like you don't believe in anything. So if you have no proof of yuchasim, you can eat truma, presumably because truma is drabanan, but you can't allow him to get married. Divrei Rebbe, right? This is what Rebbe said. Amar lo Rabbi Chia, says Rabbi Chia, I don't get it. I don't get if you're trusting the father to say he's a Kohen and he's a son, you're letting him eat truma, tamino lasio isha. You should believe him to marry a woman. If you don't believe him for marriage, you shouldn't believe him. So Amar Le, so Rebbe said back to Rabbi Chia, no. I can trust the father to say he's a Kohen to eat truma, because the father can give him his own truma, right? Meaning it's not court that gives someone truma. The father gets truma, he's a Kohen. The father chooses to feed it to his son. There's no way for us to stop him. And so therefore, since he has the power to do it on his own, we trust him. It's almost like Pesha Asar, right? Not quite, it's amigo essentially, that you allow him to, you trust him because he could do it on his own. But Eino Mamino Lasio Isha, Shem Biado Lasio Isha, right? Obviously, every time you get married, if this is important in that society, they would do a check, right? They would understand, is this person allowed to be married? And they look into the family. And so therefore, since the father obviously can't control that, his testimony is not going to be believed. So tistayim. Now again, it's very, very unclear exactly whether we believe a father by himself, right? Or if we're saying he's one of two witnesses here, right? Meaning the father would come with somebody else. What do we believe? Which seems more likely. Remember, we had the cases in the Mishnah yesterday, right? Where two men came. One said, I'm a Kohen, and the question is, can they be mitzvah for somebody else? But that's the bright. So it seems like Rebbe is the one who said that a son can be believed to be a Kohen if his father says that's the case. And says the Gemara, 3 lines on the bottom, since Rebbe is now shown to be the one who made a son be believed to be a Kohen, Rabbi Chia must be the one who was Hela Ach al pi achiv leLeviah. And it must be Rabbi Chia was the one who believed a brother to say that his brother was a Levi for that status. And says the Gemara, Rabbi Chia Maishna ben Lo. Why is it that Rabbi Chia did not believe the son is because the Karov hu Eitzel Aviv, because you can't believe a son when you're talking about a father. Ach nami Karov hu Eitzel Achiv. A brother should be the same problem. Meaning, why is there a difference between a brother and a son? Answers the Gemara at the top line. We'll stop. Well, yep. We can, let's see. It's talking about a case where Rabbi Chia accepted the testimony of a brother because the brother was being mesiach lefitumah, which literally means he was speaking at the top of his head. How we would sort of the term would be, meaning he was not speaking about establishing the status of his brother. He was telling a story, right? I remember when we were kids and my brother Jeff over here and I, we'd go and get the maaser and we would eat it and we had this big party, but you're not basically saying a story to establish the facts. And therefore you're much more reliable when you sort of just pick it up in conversation. In fact, like the very interesting and famous story, top line, there was once a person, right? He was, sitting at the bar and just telling stories. And he said, Zechroni, I remember, Shani Tinok. I remember being a very, very memory, you're like 2, 3, or whatever number. You have these vague memories. I remember, I remember, sitting on my father's shoulders. I was like, 500 feet tall, as you remember as a kid. They picked me up from school early. You have to knock on the door. You got to come home. I remember them taking off my clothes. It's biluni, and they dropped me in a mikvah, which is probably a very memorable thing as a child, right? And my father took me home, dropped me in this mikvah, because there was a special thing that there was truma, and I was able to eat it that evening. So, again, he must have been a little tiny boy, and he was just telling the story. And Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Chia would finish the story that he would say, my friends would always stay away from me, I guess because they were tamei, and their parents told them, don't go too close to that boy. And they used to call me Yochanan Ochel Chalot. I was called Yochanan who eats challah because right now I eat bread, but I eat the challah because I was a Kohen. And Halu Rebbe the Kuna Alpiv, because he told the story, it wasn't like he was getting up and saying, I'm a Kohen. He was telling the story, I guess, out of context, because if he came, it would be, otherwise it would be just, playing a game. But basically he told the story. It was well known that he would repeat the story, and he had this childhood memory, and based on that, we have relied on him to be a Kohen. And so you see that there's much more value in a story that's told lefit tumo than the story that's told to establish proof, which basically you would require a level of idut in order to establish. So we will stop there. We actually have not resolved the question, and we will continue tomorrow about what we believe a Kohen and for what status exactly. Have a good week.
Thank you. Shabbat tov.
Well, Miriam, I'm going to be home next Shabbat, but I think we'll have to figure out what time and where and all of that.
Yeah, that's Tisha B'Av, right? Okay. So
we'll definitely learn Shabbat. I don't know what we're going to do on Sunday, but we'll talk about it next week. I'm okay doing it Motzei Tisha B'Av, but I don't know if other people are. So
we'll figure it out, I guess.
Energy, yeah. We'll talk about it. Okay, Shabbat tov.
Shabbat tov. Bye.